had a notification on Twitter. Evangelical Dark Web posted it. He said, if these white people embraced wokeness back in the day, the wokeness they embraced would not have spared their posterity. He had quote tweeted Anthony Bradley, who's also reading this book.
Oh, yeah?
And he says, I'm halfway.
Who says that?
Anthony Bradley.
Says he's half white?
I'm halfway, not halfway. Halfway
okay.
through the book.
Okay.
I do believe anti-whiteness is real today. I also believe that is 100% the fault of white conservatives from 1954 to 1991 who failed to champion economic, religious, and political liberty for blacks. If the post-1970s GOPers were libertarians, CRT and DEI would not exist.
Bull.
Yeah. That's even saying that anti-whiteness is white people's fault. Again, that's the narrative. You drop them. That's what I meant by Scroder's cat.
What's crazy to me is how is it that we've gotten to a place where people can say this, it's incredible. It really is incredible.
Right.
That they can say these things and everyone just goes,
Yeah.
And nobody talks about it. How is it that the media and the government have so much control that we're not even allowed to discuss these things?
Right.
It's insane. How is it that we have a presidential candidate who can go around calling his rival a liar when he's talking about how his brother got eaten by cannibals, how...
Yeah.
I mean...
He keeps talking about his son dying.
His son
dying in the war when he didn't die
in the war. Yeah, I mean, it's one completely false lie after another, and everyone just goes, "Oh, that's just Sleepy Joe." What? Really?
I have a golf handicap of 6. I used to drive trucks. I graduated at the top of my law school class. He said all these things.
I used to drive trains.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, he's said it all, and none of it's true, and nobody bats an eye at it. That's just Joe. Joe being
I don't think they're even going to.
You think they're going to?
I don't think they're even going to take him off the ticket. If you think about it.
Well, I don't think Joe won't stand for it.
If you think about it, anybody who would take his place is running the risk of ruining their political career for the future. So if they take his place,
that's why they're running Hillary's name. There are some people running Hillary as a possible.
Well, because she wouldn't have a future. This would be her final shot.
That's right.
She's up there in her late 70s
already done
as well.
Yep.
Huh. Hadn't thought about that.
It would be kind of funny to see Trump beat her a second time.
Lock her up. Lock her up.
Oh, did you see they were chanting that?
They were chanting that about Trump.
At a Biden rally.
At a Biden rally.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
It's amazing. No, because my father-in-law has a form of dementia, and it's not pretty. It's not fun. And but watching Joe, whatever he's got doesn't appear to be nearly as advanced.
No, but did you hear Nancy Pelosi?
She's drunk most of the time.
She just came out recently and was accusing Trump of being having
senile.
dementia and being senile. You go, are you kidding?
What's the old maxim? Always blame them what you're guilty of. I'm going to try to remember that in the future.
Is that what's his name?
That was one of the rules for radicals. It's in that rules for radicals.
What's that? The author?
Saul Alinsky.
Yes. Okay. I thought that was an Alinsky thing. I wasn't quite sure.
Well, to borrow from James Lindsay, everybody's favorite fake conservative atheist, the iron law of woke projection never misses.
That's good. All right, let's tee up the next one.
All right, ready when you are.
When there's nothing left but the fire in my chest and the air that fills my lungs, I'll hold my tears and
welcome to Iron Rhetoric with your intrepid host, Pastor Bret McAtee. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own.
We welcome you to another issue of Iron Rhetoric. We continue to explore Jeremy Carl's, I would say, a landmark book, The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. There's a blurb on the front by Tucker Carlson, who's also a chap that's gotten out on the limb. Not as far as Jeremy Carl has, but still, Tucker Carlson says in this blurb, quote, "In a country where being racist is the ultimate sin, how has our ruling class gotten away with attacking the majority of Americans on the basis of their race? The answer is scary. in this outstanding book explains. Right? By the way, listeners to Iron Rhetoric, you might want to go on YouTube and look up Tucker Carlson's stint with an Australian journalist in Australia. Man, it was funny because she started out the interview just basically accusing him of being a racist, of believing in replacement theory, and saying that he's only for white people. And he said, "Could you quote me? Could you quote me where I've said that this is only a concern of white people? I'd like to see that quote." And it went downhill from there. I mean, he at one point he said, "You know what? I used to think that American journalists were the stupidest in the world, but now you're proving I'm wrong." It was a great interview. So you can find that on YouTube, Tucker Carlson, Australia journalist interview for your interest. We're looking at this chapter on 5 from Jeremy Carl's book. Remember, we've said that it almost seems like Carl's book has been dropped down the memory hole. That's the attempt. Tucker Carlson has interviewed him. There have been a few other places. I don't remember the podcast where they've interviewed him. So there have been some places that have been trying to get the word out. Stephen Wolf, in his presentation in Ogden, Utah, recently to the New Christendom Conference, recommended Jeremy Carl's book as well. So we're probing into this, and we're on this chapter of school days. I've done a lot of reading through the years on our educational system, and none of this really I found very surprising. We'll open with a quote that he gives from Papa Joe. That's what I think it was Truman. That's what Truman called Joseph Stalin. He called him, "I can handle Papa Joe," or maybe it was Uncle Joe, something like that. Man, it was Uncle Joe, I think. And Stalin said, and all tyrants have understood this. You can find quotes from Hitler saying something similar. But Stalin offers, "Education is a weapon whose effect depends on who holds it in his hands and at whom it is aimed." Actually, we could probably do a whole broadcast on just that one quote, because what Stalin is saying here is that education is not neutral. Education has an agenda, and so we would add that education is always an expression of some religion. And so when you send your children to government schools, or to any school for that matter, when you send them to schools, you're sending them to a place to be catechized. It's no different than you would send them to the minister or the elder at the church to have them catechized in that Westminster Confession or the Heidelberg. They're being catechized, and the teachers in the schools are priests that are doing the catechism. And the school books are their theology books. We used to sing songs in school. I doubt they do that anymore, but those were the hymns. So the school is very much a church type of atmosphere, and people don't realize that. And that's part of the great problem. Indeed, I just listened to a Rushdoony lecture where Rushdoony said no Christian has any business, and this is from 30 or 40 years ago, no Christian has any business putting their child in government schools. And we're going to see through this chapter why that is the case. We're just going to cite some segments here. There are a few things that are more dismaying to parents than seeing their children discriminated against in a school setting. Yet whites are discriminated against systematically in a variety of ways in our educational system from kindergarten to college. We talked about this briefly in the last podcast, but one way they're discriminated against is if they're not allowed to get ahead. If they're gifted in some way because of the No Child Left Behind program and subsequent programs to that. I think No Child Left Behind was Bush, but there have been subsequent programs to that. They're all dedicated to making sure if you're talented or gifted that you can't get ahead. And so the school is a problem that's showing discrimination against white students. And he takes a little bit of time to talk about that, opening up with the idea of critical race theory. Anything you want to observe there on that segment, Sam?
Nope, I don't think so. Just that as we move into critical race theory, I think it's interesting that was kind of a pivotal issue for Youngkin in Virginia, pushing back against it. And there are a lot of political analysts who say that that's what won him the campaign, which was flying directly upstream from the way the rest of the country was looking at these evil parents going into school board meetings and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there was even a point where they were sending letters to the FBI about these parents that were showing up at these Board of Education meetings.
Yeah, the FBI came out with a memo targeting parents as being domestic terrorists for daring to speak up at their own child's school board meeting.
It's the kind of thing over and over again. It's like this can't be reality. We can't be living in this. It's just like one long saga of looking at Joe Biden with his mouth agape, staring stupidly into the camera during that debate. It's like that's all reality. That's the way all life is.
It's a David Lynch film.
Well, the guys must be crazy where they dropped the soda bottle into the forest.
Oh, right.
Again, the reason they say that white kids are being discriminated against is this whole usage of critical race theory. What critical race theory teaches largely is that white people, and including, of course, the white children in the school, are guilty of being terrible people. They've held people back. Their ancestors have been terrible. And so what they're instilling in these children is white guilt. And so increasingly what you're finding is that kind of a self-hatred that's being promoted and pushed among white people.
And this had hit even seminaries as early as the early 2000s. It was being pushed. It was starting to be pushed.
Did you see it?
Absolutely. It got pushed in. There were several. I won't say several. There was at least one professor at Calvin who quoted that. And the denomination was sending students and parishioners to conferences that push the whole racism. The definition of racism is privilege plus power. So that means black people cannot be racist by definition because they didn't control the power structures. And so it was the evil white man.
Yeah. Anymore, though, what's ironic about power plus privilege is that, and Nietzsche actually talked about this in some of the stuff he wrote. He talked about the idea that you can get to a point where you so privilege weakness or the person that's down and under that they end up being the one who is really privileged and powered because they theoretically don't have power and privilege.
Right.
So critical race theory is endemically anti-white, and we find that all across our schools in America. He quotes here at the university level, he says, the comments of an Indian-American psychiatrist who spoke at Yale are illustrative. Quote, I had fantasies of unloading a revolver into the head of any white person that got in my way, burying their body and wiping my bloody hands as I walked away relatively guiltless, with a bounce in my step, like I did the world an effing favor. This is from someone named Aruna Kiliani. I don't even know if I can pronounce that.
An American psychiatrist.
Yeah, in a Yale school setting. And so this anti-white, I mean, imagine being a white kid sitting in that auditorium when this is being said. I wouldn't be sitting. I'd be standing up and shouting back. Oh, we're going on. Critical race theory is regularly being taught in schools. A 2021 YouGov survey found that 85% of Democrats thought America was systematically racist. Did you hear that? 85 freaking percent. 8.5 out of every 10 people who are Democrats. While 72% felt that all differences between blacks and whites were caused by discrimination. So what they're teaching here is to be ashamed of being white. I'm going on, just reading a section here. A 2022 survey by the Manhattan Institute, Zach Goldberg and Eric Kaufman was likewise illuminating. Kaufman and Goldberg surveyed more than 1,500 18 to 22-year-olds and found heavy usage of critical race theory in schools. 62% said they thought America was systematically racist, while 69% were taught that white people have white privilege. 67% were taught that America was built on stolen land. So this all ties into the whole is it called the 1617 Project?
Yes, I believe so. Something like that.
Yeah, taken up by the New York Times to once again convict white people of being, of stealing the land away from the Indian, of being just little demons. And all of this is being shoved down children's throats in the government schools, and it's continuing. It's even getting worse. He doesn't bring this up in his chapter because it doesn't really pertain to his subject matter, but now it's the case where the teachers are telling children in school, if you want to sexually identify as other than your gender, you can be assured that we won't tell your parents. So you're putting your kids into a meat grinder. I mean, I've even struggled with this. Even if you're not a Christian, why would you want to do this to your child, presuming that you loved your child? Now, I know that there's a necessity of 2 incomes, but I got to tell you, I'd move heaven and earth to find a way to not expose my kids to government schools, even if I was not a Christian. And so we find out in this chapter that how it is that kids are being turned against themselves.
I think, too, the fascinating thing is it just goes to show how little is actually being taught. I mean, when you to teach somebody to somehow get 60% of the population being taught that America was built on stolen land, what a naive view of history. Like to not even examine that land is always conquered. And before we came and conquered it, guess what? There was a tribe that had conquered a big chunk of land. And guess what? They conquered it from a different tribe.
Right.
And guess what? They had slaves. And they conquered it from a different tribe. And they had slaves. We won't talk about any of that, though. It's just the white man.
Yeah,
that's
it's
not
just
allowed
the guilty
to.
white man. Not to mention, there's a. They Were White and Slaves is the name of the book. Another book is named White Gold. Both of these books tell the story of how actually more white people have been enslaved through the course of world history than any other ethnicity or race. The Arabs, for example, they stole so many white slaves that many of the ruling houses of Arabia were becoming too white because the whiteness was valued. The female slaves. He goes on in a section called about school funding, and he talks about the idea that school district expenditures are essentially identical across races. He says that that's not true. The equality of funding is all the more remarkable given that most schools tend to be funded by local taxes, of which white parents on average are paying far larger amount than blacks and Hispanics. And so he talks about the incredible amount of money that's being spent on schools. And I got to tell you, every time I go for a walk, I have the government church, or I call it the government church, so the listener can understand the government school, where it's just across the street from me, and the junior high as well. It's a massive complex that goes for several blocks. And I keep thinking, this is repeated over and over and over again in every community in America. Can you imagine how many billions and maybe even trillions of dollars America as a nation has poured into the rat hole that's government education? It's astounding when you think about what that money could have been used for in order to educate.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, those schools are not interested in educating your children. What they're interested in, listener, is forming good little citizens by their standard. They are shaping cogs that will fit into the matrix that they're building in the rest of the cultural infrastructure. The last thing they want in these schools is somebody who can think for themselves. The last thing they want is anybody who can do critical thinking skills. And this applies not only to secondary education, K through 12, this applies to the universities as well. They are producing cogs that will fit into the machine. I had a conversation some time ago, several years ago, with a lawyer friend of mine about my age. And he said, yeah, all they're teaching us to do is to push the right buttons and to insert the right thing. We're not being taught how to think in law school. We're being taught what buttons to push. I've heard the same thing from medical doctors. Medical doctors have this kind of a catalog, and if you present XYZ symptoms, they just push that button, out comes a particular drug that you're supposed to take. They're not doing critical thinking. They're not looking at it holistically or organically. And that's because schools are the nature that they are. The same thing, guess what? The same thing is true in seminary.
Yeah, if you engage in that critical thinking, you might actually come up with something that doesn't fit the narrative, and that cannot be tolerated.
Right. It's gonna happen to you what happened to the two of us, what's happened to Michael Spangler, what they threatened to do with Zach Garris. If you begin to do critical thinking, if you refuse to bow the knee to the accepted narrative,
you're out.
You're in trouble. Even the darndest thing is, even if you can march the church fathers out even if you can give a biblical cogent argument, even if you march all these things out before them and lay out before them and say, here, it doesn't matter. And part of that is because they themselves don't have the ability to think critically, so they cannot see what you're seeing.
So there's no actually engaging in any discussion. There's no actually engaging in an argument. It's just blast away at anything that's outside of the narrative.
Right. So, and one thing I didn't learn, I should have learned, I would probably do things differently now, in going, for example, to a Presbyterian or a classis meeting, trying to stand on the floor and to try to engage in something that's mildly controversial, even mildly, you're probably just putting a big X on your chest for everybody to go after you. You'd be better served probably if you can find a way to still advance your cause and not make yourself a target. But the thing is, I don't know how you could do that.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, when did the church cease to be the countercultural thing that it's supposed to be, instead just decide to swim right along the stream?
Right. So we see the church even doing this kind of stuff. The PCA, for example, in their last General Assembly, they made a decision, I think it was on their church courts, that when they have church courts, if it wasn't church courts, it was some kind of committees, that they have to have quotas and proper racial representation. So once again, that's just buying into this, I don't want to use that word, this bad narrative. So we're talking about school funding. That's back to Carl here. I'd heard about this years ago. I'd forgotten about it, but he brings it out here. He says, between 1985 and 2003, federal judges ordered the payment of an incredible $2 billion to the Kansas City school system. That's be roughly $4 billion in today's dollars, in an aggressive attempt to remove the self-segregation by race from its schools. Local property taxes were doubled, and a special income tax surcharge was levied on everyone who either lived or worked in Kansas City, an enormous imposition, especially in a city in which whites already paid the overwhelming majority of taxes. They built spectacular new facilities at the Kansas City schools. A new classical Greek magnet school had an Olympic-sized swimming pool and racquetball facilities, among other luxuries. And then he says, test scores dropped, and white students continue to flee the system. And activist judges continue to prescribe dramatic penalties on local schools, while for some time the Supreme Court refused to step in. So again, this is another, what did we talk about in the last one? It's another transfer of wealth. So again, Carl does this over and over again. He doesn't say, here's an example of transfer of wealth, but that's what it is. And that's why the whole discussion of reparations is nuts. It's lunacy. I don't have enough words for how insane it is. Actually, we need to expand our vocabulary on the category of insane. It's like the Alaskans have, I don't know how many different words for snow because they see so many different types of it. We need to have more and more words for lunacy and insanity because we're seeing it piled up on top of itself every day. And so we see here, he makes the point, by 1990, corruption and incompetence ensured that the school district was spending less than half of its budget on actually teaching kids. So if you send your children, hear me, if you send your children to government schools, they are not being taught. All right? Can I say that any more clearly? You're raising dumb people. Okay? You're raising people that are going to be, as James says, thrown around or blown around by every what? Strange wind of doctrine. I mean, it's funny. I have a friend who has a shirt. You've heard of this shirt, and it says, "I see stupid people." And I can't fault him because it's like that we're living in this kind of context. Indeed, I even have to chide myself because when I'm around people that I don't know, I want to clam up because I'm convinced that the minute I open my mouth, I'm going to discover normies are around me, and it's going to be tough sledding. Anyway, he goes on. He talks about a section of school discipline. This was fascinating. So what they've tried to do is they've tried to bring equality into the schools in terms of discipline. And the problem was there were too many minorities, percentage-wise, that were the ones that were being disciplined. And so the solution? Well, the solution was that when they do something that they previously would have been disciplined for, we're no longer going to discipline them because that would be what? Racist. All right. On the other hand, the trigger is going to be pulled quicker on the white kids because we need to get more white kids into that category of discipline problems in order to equalize things out.
This is completely mirroring just the whole justice system and the way we talk about prisons and who's in prisons and who's not, and who's committing crimes and who's not, and who's being pushed forward to be tried for crimes and who's not.
Right. That's a great insight, and it marries well into this section because when you compare the George Floyd riots and the response to those with the January 6th protests, you see what you just mentioned. Those guys, those people in the George Floyd riots, the prison was a turnstile. They went in and they were bailed out and they were immediately back on the streets, and that was the end of it.
They were bailed out by prominent leaders.
Right.
Some.
Yeah, the vice president, Kamala Harris, had something to do with that, as I recall. Whereas those J6 protesters, I mean, what they're doing to those people is shameful. I mean, I have no doubt that there were some that needed to be thrown into the clink with the key thrown away, but that's not the majority report of the white people that they arrested and have thrown the book at. Some of those people haven't even gotten due process yet, is from what I read.
That's correct.
All right, so they talk about the issue of school discipline. He uses one prominent example where real-world school disciplinary wokeness had profound effects, and that is, of course, Trayvon Martin. You probably remember, most of you, Trayvon Martin. He was the teen that was shot and killed in a confrontation with Neighborhood Watch coordinator George Zimmerman, who was portrayed in the legacy media, or as I like to call him, the Lugan Press, as the innocent kid. And, of course, George Zimmerman was labeled as
A white
man, although he was Hispanic.
An evil white man.
Yeah.
Of course, there's no other kind.
Right. So that the whole race thing began to play in to that whole case. But they go on to say Martin's character would not have been portrayed in the same light had it been known that he'd been caught at school with burglary tools and women's jewelry in the months before he was killed. So I don't remember if you remember the play up or the way the narrative went with him, but he was this, they showed pictures of him when he was like, 11, 10, 12, whatever it was, and this little cherub face, and he looked so innocent. But what they didn't say is this guy's a criminal.
And in fact, this is another one of those things that you're not allowed to talk about. You're not allowed to notice this. In fact, that's why you still don't ever hear it in any of the narratives that talk about Trayvon Martin.
Right. And so when they talk about school discipline, which is the subtitle of this particular section, he talks about Trayvon Martin, and he says, police did not pursue the possible theft where they had the evidence on Martin. They didn't pursue it any further in an effort to reduce disciplinary infractions and suspensions of African Americans.
Yeah, so under pressure to not suspend black students, the school resource officer wrote up the jewelry as found items and never submitted a police report. Had Trayvon Martin been brought up on charges and actually gone to jail, then he'd still be alive today.
Right. And we find these kind of things happening over and over again. I read recently of a white girl that was accosted by minorities in a public school bathroom, and they were trying to sweep it under the rug, again, because of this idea that we want to have these. Now, they take these figures, by the way, they report them. They have to turn these discipline figures, the numbers in. And so the feds know, if you're meeting the standards or not. And you don't want to be found to be racist by disciplining too many minority kids. And teachers ought to get combat pay anymore, from what I understand. I talked to a sub a couple of days ago, and he said, "Yeah, I had to quit. When they started bringing in cell phones in the classroom." He said because there was no way at that point I could control the classroom, and so it's become a zoo. What's going on in our schools in terms of school discipline. It's another reason why you don't want to send your child to government schools, because you're opening them up to who knows what. Not to mention the tomfoolery that's going on now with guys entering into the girls' locker rooms saying that that they identify as girls. So he tags the Obama administration for a lot of this problem. You need to understand, Obama is a huge Marxist. This is why the man said, we're going to fundamentally, was it fundamentally? Yeah, it's transform. We're going to fundamentally transform America. That's what he meant when he said we're going to and that was on the election night in 2008, I believe it was. Yes, that's right, 2008. And Obama's still around pulling strings as it is. The next section has to do with the anti-white discrimination, SATs, and class ranks. Here again, we come with the quotas and the set-asides. Anti-white discrimination in academics and admissions is perhaps the most visible way in which anti-white policies are put in place and maintained in contemporary education. And so again, schools have to have a certain quota. You could smash the SAT and it wouldn't matter because they have to have certain pegs to put into the holes of these universities.
And it's not just anti-white in those cases. It's anti-anything that's not black. When it comes to thus the Harvard and North Carolina lawsuit that happened where a bunch of Asian and white students got together and sued to say, listen, we've got higher scores, we've got higher SATs, we've got higher grades, we've got more involvement in extracurricular activities, and we're not getting accepted over people who are less qualified. They sued, they won, and then yet you still end up with Harvard coming out with a statement saying we're going to find a workaround.
Yeah.
We're going to keep doing it. We're just going to drop SATs as a requirement.
Yeah, the Asians have gotten lumped in here so much so that they're now being called adjacent white.
White adjacent, that's correct.
Yeah, you can't make it up. And if you don't know, white adjacent means that, well, they're not white, but they have all the ideology that you find in these despicable white people. There is the ongoing attacks on standardized tests. I even saw that a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit in seminary. I had one particular guy who was had a psychology. He was a psychotherapist, sociologist, something like that. And he was one of these big guys that I'm not going to give you any tests because this isn't about a performance. This is about your ability to learn. And of course, it's self-defeating that particular practice. I have to tell a quick story here, which is again a bit of a rabbit trail. This particular guy, you had to have a paper. You had to write a paper every week, a typed page or 2 pages, and you had to turn it in every week. And then he'd give you a check. And if you got you get a check plus, that means you didn't have to reformat or redo it. And if you got a check, you had to go back and redo your paper and turn it in again if you wanted credit. So I had this buddy, his name was John, and he kept getting checks. He kept having to redo his paper, and I kept getting check pluses, and I didn't have to redo my papers. Finally, in exasperation, he said, McAtee says, what are you doing? I mean, you always get these check pluses. And I said, here's the secret. I said, I don't have a clue of what I'm reading because it's psychobabble. I don't have a clue what I'm writing. All right? But when I turn the paper in, I have no idea what I've said. And that's what gets me the check pluses. You're trying too hard. Matt, you can edit that out if you want. This is a funny story.
I think we'll leave that one in there.
All right. So he continues to talk about overwhelmingly liberal whites from elite backgrounds are still often able to game the system, leaving average white students without connections to language. So once again, the elites are getting in, and the minorities are getting in, but your middle class whites, they're the ones that they're taking it on the chin. The working collar kids, and that's the way it always tends to be. And now think about this too. Do a thought experiment. Do you really think that the children of Barack Obama or the children of Kamala Harris, if she has any children, I don't know if she does or not, the children of prominent black people like what's the race pimp that's on MSNBC, Tawana Brawley case, Al Sharpton. His kids are his grandkids. Do you really think that they're disadvantaged and that they need a leg up over middle-class white kids? Colin Powell, he's now deceased, but his grandkids. In other words, you just can't look at a person and say, oh, you're black, therefore you're disadvantaged, therefore you need some help. It may be the case that the white kid is disadvantaged and needs a leg up, but we're seeing everything through the prism of color. And now keep in mind now that this is because of cultural Marxism. This is because of woke and critical race theory. when I was in college or seminary, sure, I was aware that white and black existed, but it wasn't pressing in on me from all sides. But it is those folks, the critical race theories, the racial Marxists, they're the ones that have created this mess that's extended now to even our schools. He goes on, he talks about not content with eliminating SATs, schools are racing to do away with class rankings in an attempt to disguise merit and justify anti-white discrimination. So once again, if you're white, you're behind the black ball. Is that kind of some mixed metaphor there? And so he just, in this chapter, he continues to belabor that particular point about how white Americans are being discriminated against in schools. Because this is the case, I hope you understand, listeners, where I'm going with this. But because that is the case, the best and the brightest are not getting into our professional fields.
Which is actually kind of a terrifying thought.
Yes, that's where I'm going. It's a terrifying thought. Anymore, if I see a minority doctor or lawyer, I'm saying to myself, I'm not going there. And it's not because I'm racist. It's because I know the system has been geared that they're lifting up people that are not qualified. And why would I want to go to somebody who only got in because of the color of their skin?
Yeah, exactly. That's actually one of the things in Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Steve Saylor. He was talking about that very fact that I think they touched on the airline industry and pilots and how that we virtually eliminated crashes in this country because we had a lot of really great pilots. But now all of a sudden they're saying, no, that's racist to have those standards because they made it really hard to be a good pilot, to be a pilot. And they said, we got to make that easier. We got to dumb that down. So at some point, you got to ask the question, are the planes going to start falling out of the sky?
And they have been. You've been reading more and more about these kind of
issues.
Yeah. I mean, to me, how crazy is it to say, well, you're not the best pilot, Shirley, but because you got the right melanin and the right plumbing, we're going to put you in that pilot seat. Again, that goes back to what I said earlier. It's like living in an insane asylum.
You say Shirley, I think of that bit from Airplane. Has that become
yes,
reality?
But don't call me Shirley.
I could talk a little bit about this because I worked in the airline industry for 13 years, not as a pilot, I should add. He talks then about a section of affirmative action in college admissions. And again, it's the same old story. 63% of Americans in 2022 said universities should disregard race in college admissions. 49% of registered voters in a large Reuters Ipsos poll that same year felt affirmative action and similar policies at universities discriminated against white people versus just 38% who disagreed. 71% agreed that college admissions should be based solely on merit. Did you get that figure? That's a big figure. 7 out of 10 people should be based solely on merit. That's what I think. I mean, I don't care if you're white. I don't care if you're a minority. If you're the best, then you ought to get in.
And that was, of course, the thinking behind the lawsuit against Harvard and North Carolina was that you've got all these Asian students who are kicking everybody else's butt, and they're not getting in. And they're saying, hey, what gives? We're better. We've got higher scores. We do all this stuff. It's discrimination.
Yeah, it's interesting here. Again, you can edit this next slide out if you want, but there is one argument that I would use to say that there's one example that would not be true, and that would be if you're in a predominantly, let's use the Japanese example because that's overwhelmingly Japanese. I think Japanese should be preferred over non-Japanese in those pretend university spots. If they're even if they're a little bit less, I think they should be preferred over, let's say, somebody from Nigeria that's living in, and this is completely made up, somebody in Nigeria who has high scores. I still think the Japanese person should be the one who's moved forward over the Nigerian simply because you want to support that culture and the infrastructure of that culture. And that would apply, I don't know if you can apply it anymore to America, but once upon a time you could have applied it. Does that make sense?
No, I'm not sure I understand. So why should the Japanese be preferred?
Just because it's a Japanese culture, Japanese people. It belongs to them. It's their people. It's their culture.
So they should be allowed to prefer themselves over strangers or aliens that are coming in.
Oh, in their own country.
Right.
Okay. I thought we were still talking about Harvard. That's my bad. So,
No.
okay. No, I get you what you mean. All right.
Right. So, but that does make sense, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
It's just an extrapolation of what the Constitution said when it wrote about for us and our posterity. They wrote the Constitution for who? For us and our posterity. Well, who was their posterity? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants,
right,
in the majority.
Their people. Well, I guarantee, I mean, in China, they give preference to Chinese students over any international. I guarantee it.
Right. And neither you and I or any sane person would have a problem with that.
Every country does. Just like every country teaches their kids to support and love their country, except for ours.
Right. But I would then argue that in an odd way, we're doing the same, because right now the out people are supposedly out people are now the in people. The supposedly out people are minorities. They're really the my people of the Harvards and the Yales and the Ivy Leagues.
Right.
And so they're the ones that are being preferred because they're seen as the my people. The white person who used to be the in is now the out, and so he's discriminated against. They go on to talk about. He goes on to talk about the rigged system for trying to get into the Tony elite Ivy League schools. Who, by the way, I should add here that I was told in 1979 or so by my mentor in undergrad. He told me. He told the whole class, for that matter. He says, if you can pull an A in here, you can pull an A at Harvard or Yale or any Ivy League school you want to mention. His point is that they get all the press. They're talked about the elite, but there are still programs out there in other universities that kick the butt of the elite schools. And again, I would say that the elites are now running on reputation more than reality.
It's the narrative.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
I do know one young lady who graduated from Harvard, and I have to say she's one sharp cookie. Julia Greer, if you're out there, I'm thinking of you. All right. So it goes on and continues to give the numbers of how the white man is being discriminated against under the affirmative action program. He gives several pages of that, talking about how whites are being discriminated against in their own country. Do you want to add anything more to that, Sam?
No, I think moving on into the next section, I think it's just insane, the whole DEI bureaucracies and the amount of money that universities are pouring into this that has nothing to do with people's education. He cites even University of Michigan with 163 DEI employees listed. Yeah. 163 DEI employees. Just that's insane.
Which I wouldn't doubt many of them are making six figures.
So, exactly. It's taking resources away from teaching students, dedicated to discriminating against white students in particular.
And it's another transfer of wealth.
It's a transfer of wealth because guess who's paying for it?
Right. And guess who most of those DEI officers are? Many of them are minorities. And some of the things that those people have said into the microphone is...
Yeah, he makes the suggestion that eliminating these diversity bureaucrats at a school such as the University of Michigan would pay for hundreds and possibly even more than 1,000 full tuition scholarships for deserving students, regardless of race, each year.
But again, even after having said that, we have to again emphasize that the universities are not teaching, generally speaking, there are going to be exceptions, obviously, but generally speaking, they're not teaching the students how to think critically. They're teaching them to be monkeys, how to hit a particular button in a particular situation, whatever the program. And you know what? When you meet a doctor or a lawyer who can think critically, you should prize them. And I'll even go out on a limb to say if you meet a clergy that can do that. Part of my life is rubbing shoulders with these people, more online than in real life. And I'm here to tell you, it's obvious they have not been educated, if educated is defined as being taught to think critically.
Then he goes on to outline basically what we mentioned, I think, in the last podcast, that not just white flight, but flight from whiteness, and comparing what we have now to several decades ago, where you've got people with any kind of mixed ancestry. They want to distance themselves from the minority ancestry and claim the whiteness. I never knew this about Ted Williams, that he was half Mexican American. And I don't think most people knew that about him. I think he just was a white guy out there playing baseball. And I think he preferred it that way, probably because that's the way the world was.
It was to his advantage at that time.
At that time.
If Ted Williams was alive and hitting near 400 in 2024,
we would know that he would completely identify with his Mexican American heritage.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so you can't really blame folks for wanting to play the game. In other words, if it's going to be an advantage to their kids to get into some elite school and they've got Pocahontas in their bloodline, you can understand at least what they would say. Yeah, I'm part Indian. Or that Rachel Dolezal chick out in the West who frizzed up her hair and claimed that she was African American and served as the president of a local chapter of the NAACP. Why did she do that? Because there was advantages to not being white. And that's why the white boy summer thing is so important, is because really what white boy summer is saying, hey, white boy summer guys, are you out there? What white boy summer is saying is it's okay to be white. It's okay to be proud to be white. It's okay to thank God for being white and for having the heritage that you have. Because what's happening is the white man, the white, I prefer saying white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or white Anglo-Saxon Christian, either way. He's being beat down in his own country. And that's being displayed again by the ever decreasing demographics of the white man in America. He's being beat down.
To the point where they will actually invent things to make that happen, that beatdown. So, and he goes on in this chapter to cite that there's such a desperate demand for white racists that their demand for it outstrips the meager supply of white racists in modern academia. And so guess what? They'll make stuff up, like the African-American criminology professor at Florida State University who, guess what? He resigned in disgrace after being credibly accused of faking data to exaggerate structural racism against African-Americans. At least 6 of his papers were retracted. So they have to put the beat down on to the point where they'll make stuff up.
Right. And it's being discovered that many of these so-called sociology type of works that are being done, of thesis papers that are being written, that many of them have cooked the books. And it's not just in the soft sciences like sociology, but you're also finding it in the climate change studies that are done. They're cooking the books, they're cheating. And so you can't really trust anymore. Well, this prestigious study from this, you can't trust it anymore because you don't know what's been done in order to cook the books.
Well, and it seems like when it comes to the DEI papers, they're all plagiarizing each other.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole fiasco at Harvard where their former president who had to resign, what was he, Penn State? It happened there as well, maybe? I can't remember. Maybe it was University of Pennsylvania. I don't know. But anyway, a lot of cases of plagiarism when it came to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because, of course, Martin Luther King was a major league a plagiarizer. A lot of his material for his PhD was plagiarized. People don't know that. But, of course, even back in the 1960s, who was going to touch Martin Luther King as a PhD student? I think it was in the Boston area, as I recall. So, listeners out there, what this communicates is that you have to be proactive in educating your children, because they're not going to get it if you send them to public schools. They're not going to get it when they go to university. Matter of fact, I've got to the point now where I strongly discourage people who ask me where they should send their kids to university. I strongly discourage going to a brick and mortar university. Why should you fork out the kind of money that they're required in order to make your child hate your belief system that you taught them, hopefully that you taught them growing up? The challenge here in light of the School Daze chapter is to realize, white Anglo-Saxon Christians, is to realize that this is not pretend. Your kids are hated, and you need to be proactive in educating them, which might mean, guess what? That you need to be proactive in educating yourself. Because it's often the case that when parents start getting involved in educating their children, they realize how much they missed out. And you did. It doesn't matter. I mean, I'm almost 65. I keep saying that because I can't believe it's true. But even when I was going to school, I was blessed because I skipped out so much. I just skipped so much school. I couldn't learn anything. So I didn't have to have the burden of unlearning what I'd learned. And so don't put your children in that environment. I mean, we've only scratched the surface of the problems that come. You have the morality that becomes the issue. You have the overt hatred of Christianity. I mean, if you don't teach a God-centered worldview, you're teaching an anti-Christ worldview. And as God has been kicked out of the classroom, therefore they're teaching an anti-Christ worldview. If you send your kids to government schools, even to universities, you are sending them to a place where they'll learn to hate Christ. I remember some years ago, a woman that I went to college with, she's since deceased and gone to be with Jesus. We were communicating online, and she was, you could tell she was in tears. Believe me, I could tell online, even online. And the reason she was weeping is that she had a son that she had sent to our alma mater. Yeah, I'll name it, Indiana Wesleyan University. And he was departing from the faith because of some of the professors and classes that he was having, was basically teaching that his Christianity was trash. So why would you pay for that, parents? And you should know that the so-called Christian universities are probably the worst place. They're probably even worse than the so-called secular schools.
Oh, absolutely. I had a friend who went to St. Olaf and had a professor who thought they were doing the students a favor by breaking down their faith and leaving them in a complete crisis of faith. And that was supposedly doing them a favor.
Right. And this has been the case for a very long time now, although it hasn't been talked about. Even critical race theory is coming into place. At Grove City, for example, well, do they still call it Grove City College? I think they do.
I think so.
They, within the last year, 18 months, they had a crisis on wokeness at their place. And so it's creeping in everywhere. A couple of years ago, guys from my alma mater, again, these guys would now be 2 generations younger than me. They're writing me out of the blue, and they're telling me they're getting railroaded according to woke type things. One guy he was in the honors program at Indiana Wesleyan, and he wore a Halloween costume that was not considered PC, and they ran him out of the honors college program. They let him graduate, but they took away the whole honors. And the other chap's story was much the same.
Because they found him guilty of appropriation.
Right. Well, not being culturally sensitive. I don't remember what the costume was, but you can imagine. It could be any number of them.
Any number of things, yeah.
So the chapter on school days emphasizes the fact that the white kids are being taught to hate themselves. They're being left behind. They're being taught garbage. Right? This critical theory is just garbage, and yet it's entering into every field out there. There's critical race theory, there's critical literary theory, there's critical race theory, there's critical education theory. It's applying to every field. So they're taking it and they're applying it across the board. So I know it's difficult. I understand, but find a way to educate your children apart from what the government is offering you up. And again, even at government schools, because even at church universities, because even those church universities, guess what? They're taking from the feds, and so they have to meet certain standards that the feds give them if they're going to get that money. So again, I guess the thing I would encourage you the most as we're closing shop here for tonight is to buy your own volume of the Unprotected class. Get the straight scoop. But again, what we've been giving you is right from the book. And start being more and more self-aware and willing to understand this so that you can honor Christ. Christ is not honored. I mean, we're told to honor our father and mother. And what DEI does and what critical race theory does is it's a programmatic effect for white people to no longer honor their parents or their grandparents or their forebears before them. It's an attack on the fifth commandment. And as biblical Christians who want to honor Christ, we should not stand for that. Any last words?
It's all good.
Okay. Well, thanks for attending here on Iron Rhetoric, where we do teach you how to think critically. and we are at war with the modern racial narrative. We do think that if we lose this, because it's a proxy war of against Christianity, if we lose here, we're going to go back to the catacombs. In other words, if we don't win on this issue, Christianity is going to have to go underground. And we don't think that that's something that we should embrace without fighting. So God bless you and good night.
Oh, brothers, can you hear my voice, or am I all alone? If there's no fire to guide my way, then I will start my own.
Thank you for joining us today. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube Music. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, like, and share.